All right, so what did everyone think of the assignment? Was that informative? Now, this is actually a skill. This is why I post things. It may seem like I was just waiting until the last minute. However, it's not true. Maybe a little true, but not entirely true. This is a skill you're developing, right? So, you know, when you're out there on rotations, you know, are you expected to know every single thing out there in the medical world by the time you get on rotations? No, you're expected to look stuff up, right? But being able to look stuff up quickly and being able to kind of educate yourself very quickly is an important skill, right? So especially if a patient comes up to me, hey, I just read this article that says that if I eat chocolate, I'm going to live to be 100 years old. And you're like, well, that's obviously not true, but where are they actually getting this from? You can go and look up the article and find out, okay, well, this is why it's not true. Here's why the headline said that, but here's what the article actually said, right? So that's an important skill to have. So anyway, so let's go through and start to answer some questions about cannabis use and looking at these adolescents making their sexual debut in high school. And again, obviously we know the safest form, birth control is obviously just being a big nerd in high school. Kept me safe for many. I'm just kidding. Anyway. So let's go ahead. I'm going to go do a random number generator here. So everyone has their number. So 32. Let's see who 32 is. Our lucky victim. I mean contestant. All right, Emily Parker. Where are you at? Where'd you go? Please stand up. It's just a conversation. This is a safe space, right?
No beta blockers?
No beta blockers allowed, no Xanax allowed, no alcohol, no shots out in the hallway, or anything like that. So let's talk about the article real briefly. So if you can, just kind of describe, like, just briefly, kind of the setup for the article. Like, what are we actually looking at? Why do we care? Was that the only thing they looked at? Mm-hmm. Was cannabis the only illicit substance they looked at? No, right, they looked at a lot of other things, right? So they looked at like cocaine, they looked at synthetic cannabinoids, they looked at hallucinogens, you looked at all the different names they applied to the different slang terms, like China White for heroin. That's like Doobie Brothers terminology from like the 70s. I don't know how many people call it that anymore. Okay, thank you. You can sit down. So let's go to number 10. Who is that? So Richard, hang on, please stand up. Where'd you go? Where's he at? There he is. So why do we care about this? What's the point of even looking at this information?
Trying to see if there's any correlation between cannabis use and experience at early age.
Why would we care though?
Just we're trying to read that, or trying to bring the numbers down. We're concerned about.
Is there any issues with like early, first sexual encounters?
Really bad television shows.
Hmm?
Really bad television shows.
Maybe really bad television shows? Early pregnancies, perfect. We would like to prevent many early pregnancies, right? That could be bad, especially when a 15-year-old may not have the social support in order to handle a baby. I'm a 33-year-old and I can barely handle 2 babies, so just go to show you that would be one thing. What else could we possibly be caring about with these kind of early sexual encounters? STDs are a big one, right? So communicable diseases are a big one, right? So that's other things. So we can look at any kind of correlation to see, like, well, there's something that maybe is influencing this, or is any sort of correlations. Maybe you can try to target some things like health education, right? So that's actually one of the points I make in this, saying that, hey, if we can look to see, like, who are the most at-risk students, that we can try to gear our educational interventions towards those people, right? So that way, if you can skew it more towards, well, if I know that kids that are less than 12 are really a high risk, maybe I can try to educate them, because guess what? By the time they're 16, guess what? They've probably already started having sex. They've already started, smoking weed. They've already done these high-risk sort of behaviors that maybe you've lost out on the opportunity, right? So, and this is a big thing as far as that epidemiology goes. You can sit down, where you'll I'm just letting you know. From the epidemiology side, right? So again, this is not like an intervention where we're saying we're comparing, we're going to make these people smoke weed and these people not smoke weed and then see who has sex. Like that's not really that type of study. What we're trying to do is looking at kind of what's happening out there in the world, right? It's more of an observational sort of study where we can take that information and apply it to things like, grants, right? So maybe by using this information, I can write myself a grant saying I need money to help me with educating these really at-risk students. And this is the reason why I think they're at risk, right? Based off the correlations we see in the study. Okay, so that's part of epidemiology. It's a lot about health education and health prevention and things like that. Okay, so getting into the actual questions, the first one we want to ask about is what is the hypothesis of this study? So let's find out. Number 23. Who's 23? All right, Kendall.
Hi.
Hello. What is the hypothesis of this study?
I guess Emily already kind of stated it,
Mm-hmm.
but we're looking at the age at which adolescents initiate cannabis use and saying that it is associated with the age of their first sexual intercourse in the United States.
Okay, so basically saying that the earlier these students are initiating use of cannabis, they're also associated with earlier sexual encounters, right? Right, so there seems to be a correlation with what they're hypothesizing, right? And it would stand to reason. Do you think that seems reasonable?
Yep.
Why is that?
I guess if they're like more likely to experiment with cannabis, more likely to experience with sex, like experiment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe depending on the social circles or maybe the socioeconomic status can be playing a role here as well. Lots of different factors, and so that's one of the things they wanted to look at to see, especially when they're getting into some of these other variables, seeing how those also were playing roles here, especially when they get into like odds ratios and stuff. Good. So in this case, what would you say the null hypothesis would be?
That there's no association, like cannabis use is not associated with early sexual.
Perfect. Yeah. So in that case, the null hypothesis would say there's no association between these two. They're completely independent of one another. Fantastic. Thank you. Let me sit down. Okay. Okay. So what is the design of the study? Number 3. Who's that? Felicia. Everyone looks so pained when they see that.
It's a cross-sectional analysis.
Okay, so cross-section, what does that mean? So when you take a cross-section of something, what are you looking at? Just a single point in time, absolutely, yeah, absolutely. So again, is this more of, this is not really like an interventional sort of study. Would you consider this prospective or retrospective? Yeah, it's retrospective, right? Because we're looking back in time, right? We're looking at this database to see kind of what this slice in time is kind of showing us, right? Now, what do you think is maybe a limitation of looking at just a cross-sectional sort of study like this? It lists as one of the limitations later on too. Well, sometimes you can't really look at the kind of the preceding events, or you can't look at the chronological order of these things actually happening here, right? So in these cases here, you're asking students, okay, well, when did you have your first, when did you first start encountering cannabis, and when did you first start having sex? You don't know whether it was a chicken or the egg sort of phenomenon here. So which one came first, which one came second? Maybe that is playing a role. Maybe for whatever reason, people have their first sexual encounter, like, man, I really just want to go do some weed right now, right? I would like to smoke a marijuana. Where is it at? No, but we can't really tell that, right? We're only looking at this case of and one of the concepts we'll look at, and you can sit down, is a case of prevalence versus incidence. Anyone know the difference between the two? Yeah, so incidence is kind of new cases going on. So if I were to take this study and I were to say look at the kind of the baseline, if I were to interview several students and start at the baseline and then kind of follow them in time and then give them that survey again to see what had changed, I could look at the incident cases of say people first encountering marijuana, right, or having their first sexual encounter, or doing China White, or whatever the case may be, right? I can look at that sort of a prospective sort of nature there, and so that would be considered incidence of new cases. Prevalence, on the other hand, would be what? Yeah, people that already have that phenomenon or that encounter at that one particular point in time, right? So again, I could take a snapshot of, say, PA students in this room, and I can say the prevalence of males in this classroom is whatever, 20 some odd or 30 some odd cases, right? That's a prevalence, right? It's not like I'm looking at new cases going forward. I'm just taking that snapshot and seeing who is meeting that criteria, yes or no. Okay. So in this case, am I looking at incidence or prevalence? Looking at prevalence, right? Because again, giving a survey to these students and saying, okay, well, have you had, you know, an encounter with marijuana? And no, yes, no. You know, have you had an encounter with sex? Yes, no. That would be the prevalence. Go ahead.
Just a summary. Just incidence is a prospective point of view, whereas prevalence is a retrospective point of view.
Yeah. So basically, and there are some cases where you can look at it retrospectively, looking at incidents, but basically, you're starting at one time point, you're going forward to a certain period of time, and you're looking at new cases that have happened. Right? Versus with prevalence, you're just looking at one single point in time saying, well, how many people in this group have the thing that I'm looking for, right? So in this case, you know, have had sex or have had an encounter with marijuana, whatever the case may be, right? So absolutely. And that'll be important when we're talking about that in the epidemiology stuff later on, because you'll see that term incidence and prevalence, it's important to use it correctly because they mean, you know, pretty different things there. Good. Right, so we said it's retrospective. We said it's a cross-sectional sort of study. Where were they getting their information from? The survey. What would anyone remember the name of it? It's YRBSS study. So does this mean that the people who wrote this article, and anyone see when this article was written or when it got published? This year, yeah, actually pretty recent. I think it was like November 6th is when it got published. Or August, yeah. So okay, it's accepted on August 16th. So again, the accepted date is sometimes different than the actual published date. So you may see there's a little bit of a delay there. But yeah, so again, pretty recent, right? So again, within the past 6 months or so. So you know it's recent. And then also you can see where you can sometimes look to see where it was published at. One of the things you can do when you're kind of researching this stuff, especially if you get kind of drill down, you're kind of more into a particular area of study. So for instance, like I like toxicology or I like emergency medicine with pediatrics, right? So you kind of get a feel for the people who are kind of writing in that arena. And so you can look here, okay, this is actually from FIU. So, you know, actually a local area or a college, you know, is actually writing about this. And you can look up these different authors and see, like, what have they done previously, right? You can see, is this something that's their area of study that they know a lot about? That way you can have a little bit more confidence in the conclusions that they're drawing. Or is this the first time they've ever actually looked at this and they have no idea what they're talking about? So these are some things you might actually look at, especially when you get more in depth on a particular specialty. Anywho, right, so they're pulling this thing. So did they actually run these surveys themselves? The CDC did it, right? So again, they're pulling from a national sort of database here and pulling that information. And so they're just really doing the analysis, right? So again, they are relying on that data being accurate. They're relying on that being reported and having all the numbers there. But again, they're not doing the actual study themselves. They're just taking this data and just doing analytics on it. Now, as far as ease of study, you think this is pretty easy to do, pretty difficult to do? It's pretty easy, right? You know, imagine how many people do we include in the study? How many students? 13,683. Do you think it'd be pretty easy to go and interview that many students and give them these surveys? It's pretty difficult. However, the CDC has a lot of resources. They're national, right? And so in that case there, this is a pretty easy type of study you can do where you can pull data that's already been collected and just kind of do some stats on it, right? Now, how much reliability would you say that, you know, I can actually prove cause and effect of this sort of information? How do we say, what's the best way to make a cause and effect sort of assessment? Prospective, what type of study? Experimental, but more commonly randomized controlled trial, right? So if I could randomize students into different groups and then kind of see what the outcome was, then that would give me the most evidence of this is a true cause and effect sort of correlation I'm seeing here. With this type of data, you can't really make that strong of an association. You can say there are correlations here though, right? However, does correlation equal causation? Absolutely not, right? So could you ever take this study, anything as they say, and say, man, early cannabis use causes early teen sex? Absolutely not, right? So again, be careful because you'll see articles that will pop up and they'll say, like, look at this study. It says that if you smoke pot, you're going to have sex early and you're going to get pregnant. That's not really the case there, but people will run with those kind of articles all the time, and that's when your patient is going to come to you and be like, my son is smoking marijuana and I'm really worried about him having early sex, and this article says he's going to do that. And then your answer would say, or you would say to them, that's not actually the case. When you actually look at the data, it just says that there's an association here. Now, that can be difficult to educate your patients on the differences there because when they hear that, they're just going to say, oh my gosh, this is actually true. This is happening. But again, you have to temper that. You have to be able to say, okay, well, here's what they actually showed. Okay, so it's an important skill you're going to have to be able to work on. Anywho, so the next question up. So we said what the design was. So what is the independent variable, the dependent variable, and what type of variables are these? Okay, so there's a couple questions in there, so I might ask a few people to help me out with that. So 48. Everyone gets really nervous. Who's 48? Not yet. There's Did I pronounce that right? I probably said that wrong. Thanks. Okay, so first question here. What would you consider to be the independent variable?
The age of initiation of cannabis use.
Okay, and is that the only independent variable that we had?
They only have alcohol, tobacco.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's actually a lot of different independent variables that we're actually looking at here. And so again, it depended on the type of analysis they were making, right? So again, they made a lot of different comparisons here, right? They were looking at things like effect of race on early sexual encounters. They were looking at effect of cannabis use, but also a lot of other drugs like amphetamines and hallucinogens, non-medical use of prescription drugs. Like, they looked at a lot of different things. So a lot of those would be considered independent variables there. How about any dependent variables?
That would be the age of sexual initiation.
Yeah, good. So, and again, how do they break that up?
Things like when you were 15, 14 when you were younger, and then older than 15.
Good. And so, in looking at that, what age of patients do we have to have included in the study? What do you think? Help them out. Help her out. Well, what if could you include someone who's age 12 in the survey?
Oh, it's I felt like they didn't include them because they had time to like either initiate or not.
Yeah, so they could have, later on, had they been interviewed a few years later, maybe they could have been one of these cases, but that would be important. We talk about exclusion criteria in just a little bit. All right, thank you. Well, then let's talk about the type of variables that we have here. So who's 29? 29, Emily. You can stand up. Come on, everyone.
So, which one are you on?
Yeah, so just asking, like, what type of variables were we using? Were we using nominal, ordinal, continuous variables? What do you think?
So I was thinking nominal.
Okay.
I was between nominal and ordinal, but I didn't know if the order, I know it was about ages.
Mm-hmm. So you're right. Anyone can provide any further clarification? What do you think? Actually, answers we use both, right? So let's look at this. So let's looking at the actual article itself. You can see how they were breaking down individuals. So this, they did these for all the different variables you'll see here. So for instance, when they were looking at, let's look at non-medical use of prescription drugs. So, okay, during your life, you can sit down. How many times have you used, OxyContin, Percocet, all that sort of stuff? They said responses included 0 times, 1 to 2, 3 to 9, 10 to 19, 20 to 39, or 40 or more times. Now again, if I'm using that much non-medical use of prescription drugs, I don't know when I would be able to actually clearly tell you if it was 39 versus 40 or more times, but some of these are pretty strong, they'll mess with your head, I should say. But how would you classify that variable there? Would you consider that nominal, ordinal, or continuous?
Ordinal.
It's ordinal. Why is it ordinal?
You can rank them, but you can tell the difference.
Right, you can rank them, right? So I can easily say that 20 to 39 times is different than 3 to 9 times, right? I can say that's more than, say, 3 to 9 times. But what do you notice about the breakdowns between the how often they were doing it? It's not always the same, right? It goes 0, and then it was 1 to 2, but then 3 to 9, and then 10 to 19. So the ranges were getting bigger and bigger, right? There's still an inherent order between them, which is what makes it ordinal. But again, I can't say this is a continuous variable. Now, what if the patients or the students had just answered the survey? How many times have you done this? And they said 19, or they said 23. How would you consider it then? That would be a continuous, right? Because again, there would be a very distinct number there that you can then compare to other numbers. Right? They all have the same difference in value between them, right? Now, the question is, did they always use the ordinal variables, or did they go ahead and try to break it, make it a little bit easier to work with? And so what they did here is that for the study, responses were dichotomized into no if answers 0 times the original question, or yes if they had any other valid answer. So at that point, what does it become? It's nominal, and then more specifically, it's it's a binomial sort of thing. So it's yes, no, right? So again, did you ever use these drugs, these prescription drugs non-medically? Yes or no? Okay, so oftentimes you'll see that when they do these studies where the questions were asked a specific way, they will take that data and then try to simplify it down because, again, they just want to know yes or no. Okay, and that makes it a little bit easier when you're kind of making these comparisons that we'll see in just a little bit. So they took things that were ordinal originally and they turned it into a nominal sort of variable. So again, when you said, I'm not sure if it's either one, you were correct. It was both, right? Very good. And they did that for a lot of these. So you can just kind of look at them and see how they were changing a lot of the ordinal scales into just a nominal yes-no sort of thing. However, some of them they did keep nominal, or they did keep ordinal. Anyone remember which ones those were? So again, the big one is going to be the cannabis initiation here, right? So this is a good example where they either never used it, less than 12, 13 to 14, or greater than 15. So again, this is still an ordinal scale here, right? So again, some of these they kept as ordinal. They did not convert all of them to nominal, but a lot of them were going to be things that were maybe having an influence here. Because again, what do you call those factors that are having an influence on the main outcome that you're actually looking at? Confounders, right? So those are confounders, and that'll be really important when we're talking about how we control for those confounders a little bit later, okay? Because again, confounders do what? They can skew your data, right? So again, if someone was, say they had a really early initiation of, say, cannabis use, but they also had early initiation of heroin use, well, maybe they're running in those social circles where that's just going to be much more likely, and so that could be skewing your data a little bit. So it'll be important when we're looking at our analyses and how we're going to control for that in just a little bit. Okay, very good. Moving on. How are the patients included or excluded from the trial? How are they assigned to each group? So let's see. Number 3. Did we already call number 3? Oh my gosh, I'm not going to be that mean to you. 60. Who's at the very bottom of the list? All right. Kathleen. Yes. Okay, so tell me, how are the patients included or excluded from the trial? How did they actually get these students into the study?
They just did a survey, but they had to be at least 15 years of age, and then they excluded obviously younger children who even said yes, I think, or if they reported either or both to the cannabis use. So they excluded those. Okay. And then we said they didn't include the younger children because they had time to initiate the event.
Yeah, very good. Thank you. So another question would be, where was this study performed? Where do they get this information from geographically? The entire U.S. Okay, so that's important. Why? Yeah, if this was a study that was just done on a survey based in Florida, could you then extrapolate that information and apply it to people who are in Alaska, people who are in California? Maybe not, right? What do you call that when you are able to take that information and apply it to a greater population? When you're generalizing that information, call that generalizability, right? So you're looking at how generalizable is that information, how much can I apply that to the information. Yeah, that's part of the statistics of it too, right? But commonly you'll hear talking about the generalizability, right? So again, if I have a study that's done in a very narrow sort of population, it may not be all that applicable to people who are in kind of the wider population. However, in this case, we were able to get students from all over the U.S., right? Now again, what do you think about the number of people that we included? Our N was what? Pretty large, there's like several thousand individuals there. So do you think that's pretty good, pretty bad? Pretty good for a survey analysis, right? That makes sense. It's based off a nationwide sort of thing. Now, obviously, there are a lot more students in that, but hopefully that's going to be somewhat representative, right? Now, again, we have no idea specifically if there are any states that might have been missing out, but also in the limitations, who do they say may be underrepresented here? Yeah, so maybe kids are being homeschooled, or maybe people have dropped out. They may be missing from that information, right? So again, that could be confounding our results as well, since they're not included. Their information is never entered there. Okay. Good. And then we obviously, based on survey results, I said they kind of assign people into different groups based off of that. And now we'll go into our different analyses we'll see here in just a few minutes, into our comparisons. The other question is, well, what do you think about these surveys? So let's go ask a random individual here. 59. Boy, it didn't seem too random, but all right, Sarah. So what do you think about these young adolescents filling out a survey? Do you think that information is accurate? Okay. Are you saying adolescents lie? Interesting. Okay. What's one of the ways that we can help them to try to be honest when they're answering these surveys? Yeah, we try to make it anonymous, right? And so, of course, you're handing these out, and you're like, just so you know, we're not going to look at these. We're not going to actually associate the person with any of this information. So hopefully that helps out with some of the, trying to take away some of that fear of being honest. But the other thing is, you said, so drug use might be, say, underrepresented because you are, not wanting to admit that sort of thing. What do you think about the first sexual encounter? Underrepresented, overrepresented? Why do you think over?
People are cocky.
Interesting choice of word. Yeah, it depends on the person, right? So you may find that some people may be overrepresenting. Maybe they're saying like, oh yeah, that one time with my girlfriend in Canada versus someone who's like doesn't want to actually admit it. There, maybe they had like a really bad encounter and they were like, ooh, I actually don't even want to count that, right? And so, but I mean, like seriously, there could be cases of sexual abuse or anything where they may say like, I don't want to be, kind of owning up to that, so to speak. So that could definitely be something where things could be under or overrepresented there. All right, you can sit down. Thank you. Yes, sir. Okay, yeah. So those are the big things, right? So again, you have to take this information with a grain of salt. These are adolescents. You hope they're answering truthfully because you have at least anonymized the information. However, people are going to inherently lie in some cases or withhold information, or maybe they've omitted certain information. What if they were utilizing other medications and they totally forgot about the fact just because they were so altered from a mental status perspective, they don't even remember smoking pot, right? So there could be things there where they may have omissions due to just not remembering. Okay, so that could be the cases there. Very good. Let's see. So what were the outcome measures of the studies? We kind of alluded to some of these already, but let's try again. Number 9. All right, Melissa. So what are some of the outcome measures we were looking at in this study?
So some of the outcome measures were the distribution between the variables according to the age of cannabis use and the age of sexual initiation.
Okay, so what are some of the other things we were looking at?
Like the grade that they were in.
Okay.
Like if they, like race.
So like what other things you can look at the comparisons we were making in the study to see some of the things they were looking at. So what do you see here? So race was one for sure.
Oh yeah, like the grades, how they identify sexually. If they use alcohol or not. Suicide attempt, bullying.
Yeah, so lots of different things that are here, right? So what is the point of looking at all these different these measures here?
Oh, because it's for like compounding reasons, like compounding factors.
Not more confounding, right? Not compounding, but confounding, right? And that could skew our information, right? So what do we do with these? What do you do with these outcomes? And then how do we use that when we're making our comparisons? You acknowledge them, good, and then you control for them, right? That's where when we talk about controlling for these variables, you're going to see when we look at the different odds ratios, some of them are controlled for, and you'll see some of the analyses where they're not controlled for. You'll see how that's going to change odds ratios. Thank you. Right, so again, they're looking at lots of things. Now, can you include every single factor that could be playing a role here? Talk about bullying, they talk about suicide attempts, they talk about, steroid use. I mean, do you think it's pretty comprehensive, not comprehensive? I think it's pretty good. I think they include a lot of different things. Now, obviously, they can't include everything, but by including that information where it was available, I think they did a pretty good job of trying to hit the major sort of confounders you may think about. Now, what are some ones you may have wanted to include if you were to rerun this study, if you were to redo the survey? Yeah, that's a very good one. So siblings, that could be playing a role there as well. If you see, monkey do. If you see your older sibling who is smoking pot, maybe you would be more likely to do that, right? Yeah, socioeconomic status would be very interesting to include. Maybe if they came from a single-parent home or a dual-parent home, right? What else? Yep, we could do parents' occupation.
If it's legal in their state.
That's a very good one. I think is interesting. So again, when was the survey, the information they're pulling from, done? 2015, right? Yeah, so the information was actually from 2015. That's when that cross-section was done. Is that still applicable to 2018, you think? It's probably pretty good as compared to if I were to do the survey, say, back in the 80s, right? So again, things change over time. And again, we're adding new states that allow for recreational medical use of marijuana every single year. So even now, the midterms, there's a few extra states, I believe, that include, Canada is now allowing for recreational use. And again, a lot of those border states, you may see a little bit of transmittance there across the border. So again, things change, but I think 2015 probably pretty good. I don't know, adolescents have changed all that much in 3 years. But again, knowing what state they were coming from, whether or not recreational marijuana was allowed in their state, whether that was legal or not. Because again, when it's legal, it increases the access to it, may increase your chances of someone being exposed to it, right? So very good. Any other ones you can think of? Yeah, so actual physical location would be very good. The religious background may be something they can include as well. You know, what type of school they were going to, whether private versus public. You know, so lots of different things you can think about as being confounders that they may not have been able to control for. So again, you're thinking about those things in the back of your mind. Is okay, well, they didn't include that. Do I actually care or not? Right? Some of them you do care about. Some of them you're like, man, I don't really care so much about. And so that's you as a clinician kind of making those judgments there. Again, as you're applying this information maybe to your patients or to your population you deal with. Very good. Okay, so now let's get into the actual summarizing the results of the study. Are they statistically significant? Are they clinically significant? Okay, so we're going to break these up into a couple of different points here. So my first friend was going to be 14. Samantha. I don't know. Okay, so first off, let's look at the first table here that we have. And so we're looking at, basically what is this telling us?
Whether there's an association or not between the age of cannabis use
Mm-hmm.
and early onset of sexual intercourse.
Good. So you're looking at this and you see, okay, well, I see the age the participants, you know, said they first started using cannabis, and I see all these different independent variables here, right? So again, the dependent variable would be what?
Outcome being PSI or
Well, this could be the age of cannabis initiation, right? Because again, you're looking to see based on these different independent variables. You're kind of breaking them down based on the categories. So the dependent in this case would actually be the age of cannabis initiation here, right? The first one you're looking at, though, actually it would be sex, but then getting into, where's it at? I'm trying to find it on here. This one don't include. Yeah, so this one is just specifically looking at cannabis initiation versus these other independent values here. So when they say a p-value, what does that mean? What kind of a different what kind of comparison are they making here?
whether it's statistically significant.
Okay, so that tells us whether or not these are statistically significant. Based off p-values, do you think they are?
Yes.
Yes, true, because it's less than 0.05, not 0.5, right? 0.05. But what does that really tell us? Okay. Let's dig down a little deeper. So go ahead and sit down. Let's look at what they were actually comparing here. So again, this is where the methods are really important, because you have to look at what type of statistical analysis they were actually doing. So looking at this one, you see what they're talking about data analysis, very important aspect here. They're basically talking about using these frequency distributions of all the measured variables and computing these descriptive statistics. So this is just telling us kind of describing the different factors here with these students, right? And then they were to take distribution of these control variables, and then what they did was they actually were to compare them using a chi-square test. Does anyone remember what the chi-square test does for us? It looks at the frequency of an event happening, or these different variables, and tells us whether the frequency that we're seeing is just due to random allotment, just random chance that the frequency distribution is as it is, or is there something that is skewing it to where it's very unlikely that this is due to chance alone. So table 1 is actually looking at this this chi-square sort of test here. So what they were looking at in each of these cases, let's take sex for instance, right? So we're comparing male versus female. They're looking at the never use cannabis, less than 12, 13 to 14, and then 15. They're looking at these frequencies here, right? And so again, these are all basically different categories you're comparing them in. And you're saying, like, if this is just due to random chance, would we expect to find something like this kind of distribution? And what they actually find is it's very unlikely that this is just due to chance alone. In fact, it's less than 0.001. So less than 0.1% chance this is actually due to just chance alone. So that tells us that yes, this distribution is not just due to random chance. There's something going on here. Now, does this say that, you know, more males or females were more likely to smoke marijuana earlier? This does not tell me that, right? This is not actually making that sort of comparison. This is just looking at the frequency here. And so this is where that chi-square test is really helpful. Again, this is where we need to dig down further, though. This is where we can dig down and see whether any of these variables actually had an actual or playing a role here. And that's when we're talking about odds ratios a little bit later on. Okay, so table 1's good, but it's basically just kind of telling us these frequencies, whether or not these are just due to random chance or there's actually something kind of skewing it. It's very unlikely these are due to chance alone. And again, all of these are significant except for the bullying. So what do you think about that? So again, it would appear that if you're kind of stratifying people whether or not they were bullied in the last 12 months, it did not appear that this frequency would be probably just due to random chance, right? So again, there's a 10% chance, 10.5% chance this is just due This could happen, any given distribution, right? So again, in this case, that would not be considered statistically significant. Okay. Now again, overall, I probably don't really take a whole lot of information out of this particular table here. It's interesting just from a descriptive sort of standpoint, but I don't really get a whole lot of info about it, about the, the kind of the association between cannabis use and first sexual encounters. Okay. So that's what we're going to dig into with our other tables. Just a few seconds here. So now we're getting into looking at the actual comparisons here. Okay. So let's call on another friend. 58. I feel like we're going right at the bottom of the list here. Let's see. Miss Chelsea. Hello. Okay, so looking at table 2, what do you kind of what do you think this means when it says reference here? Okay, so we'll talk about the different comparisons here as far as unadjusted versus adjusted. When it says reference here, what does he think this means? Anyone help her out? This is the control variable, right? So remember we talked about how you need to have a control variable that you were comparing these other things to in this case. So in this case here, you're looking at never use cannabis. That's our control because basically they never used cannabis before, and then comparing these other groups to that never used cannabis group, right? So then we can look to see these odds ratios to see what is the odds of people that started smoking cannabis less than 12 compared to the people that never smoked, right? And so again, this is based off the early sexual initiation, right? So again, you're using the independent variable of when they started cannabis initiation versus the dependent variable is early sexual initiation. Okay, makes sense? So let me ask you one more question. Out of this group, do you think any of these are non-significant? And how can you tell? Because again, they don't give you p-values, right? So you're like, oh no, I don't have a p-value. I can't tell if it's significant or not. But you, after taking this class, will say, no, I can tell. So the odds ratio, I'm comparing one thing versus another. So if there's no difference, what do you think the odds ratio would be? 10 divided by 10 is 1, right? So again, remember, 1's our level for significance there. So if it crosses 1, then it's considered non-significant. So are any of these non-significant just based off of cannabis use? Or initiation, I should say? Looks like all of them are pretty much significant. This one kind of just hits the line there at 1. I would consider that significant, but just barely, right? And so again, I might take less stock of it versus if I saw, say, a bigger odds ratios there. All right, thank you. Let me sit down. So just looking at this, what can you kind of tell? What kind of inferences can you make? So odds ratios means the bigger it is, the more likely it is to occur in that group versus the control. So what can you tell from this? The younger you start having initiation of cannabis exposure, the younger you're to likely have an early sexual encounter, right? And then again, what was the cutoff point for that early sexual encounter? Less than 15, right? So less than 15 versus greater than 15, okay? So it's saying that the younger you start smoking cannabis, there seemed to be a correlation there where they're also having sex earlier, right? And so again, you can say that those people had a higher odds of this occurring, 18.2 times greater than those that never smoked cannabis in the first place. Okay. Again, this is a correlation, it's not causation, it's just saying that this is what we're noticing here between these two groups. Now, when you're looking at unadjusted versus adjusted, let's figure out what that means. So, another random person, 54. Tatiana, where are you at? You just hide. Thank you. All right, fantastic. So, when you're looking at unadjusted versus adjusted, what do you think this means? Your neighbors can help you out.
Outliers?
Not necessarily outliers so much, but what is it controlling for?
Oh, so if you're adjusting for like lesbian, gay, bisexual.
Okay.
Or any other discrepancies.
What do you call those? Because it could be skewing your data. There are other variables, but what are they doing? They're confounding your data. Thank you so much. Yes, you may say that. Yes, so these are confounders they're controlling for. So what you see here, this is the unadjusted odds ratios, right? So they're just comparing these groups together. However, when you look at the adjusted odds ratio, this is when you're controlling for these different factors here. So whether or not, and again, you can look down at the legend here in the table, and this is very handy to look at these. It'll give you a lot of information about what they're actually doing as far as comparisons go. So you see here, adjusted, they have the little A there, and you go down and read what the little A is. Adjusted for sex, race, grade, sexual identity, age of tobacco initiation, age of alcohol initiation, non-medical use of prescription drugs, steroids, blah, 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 right? They're controlling for all those different factors here. And seeing, okay, if you're just individually looking at the age of initiation of cannabis use versus whether or not they had an early sexual encounter, is there still an association there? And so what do you find? Yes, there is. There's still going to be an association there. Especially for these younger patients, right? Less than 12, you still see that there's an association there, right? 6.4 times higher odds that they are going to have that early sexual encounter. Now, why do you think the confidence interval, or why do you think, I guess, the odds ratio got smaller when we started to adjust for those? Well, people who maybe are initiating cannabis at an early age, what do you think they might else be doing? Maybe they're partaking of drugs early, right? Maybe they're getting into other stuff. You know, the old adage that, you know, marijuana is a gateway drug, right? Maybe they are in those social circles where they're using more of these medications or illicit substances, as the case may be. But by controlling for that, we're saying, okay, let's just take all that out. Let's control for those variables and just look at whether or not they had early initiation of cannabis and versus when they had sex for the first time. Okay, that kind of makes sense. So when you adjust for all those things, you typically will see that your odds ratios will get smaller. But also, what do you notice about the confidence intervals? They tend to tighten up too a little bit. And so you're going to find that, yes, it's still smaller. However, it's still significant. And so you can still say, yes, this is statistically significant in this case, that people who initiated cannabis earlier are more likely to have that early sexual encounter. Does that make sense? Okay, and you can kind of do the same thing for each of these. You could say, as far as male versus female goes, again, do you see as far as here the females were the reference, so that was the control, versus the males? What do you see here? This one's kind of borderline significant. I probably wouldn't take a whole lot of stock on that. However, when you control for all those other variables, now all of a sudden you see what? This has actually got a little bit stronger association, right? So again, the odds are a little bit higher for those, and again, it's a little bit more significant because it's farther away from 1 there. Okay, but again, not as strong of association as you would see with early cannabis use. That makes sense. So again, here you see that the strongest association, the strongest sort of increase in odds is what? Early cannabis use, right? So again, the earlier you started, the more the highest odds ratios here versus everything else. Okay, does that make sense? You see why we adjust for these things? We have to adjust for confounders to make sure they're not skewing our data, or to see that if we still have significance even when we adjust for those confounders. Okay, so this is kind of the bulk of table 2, and this is what I think is probably the most important information to take away from this when you're actually kind of analyzing it, because again, their primary hypothesis was what? Early initiation of cannabis led to early sex, right? So again, this is the prime thing they're actually looking at. This is the information you want to take away from this, and this is what we're seeing is that yes, they appear to be, based off the information they have, to be vindicated in that. Yes, I can reject that null hypothesis and says there's no association between the two. Okay, good to know. And then next up we have table 3. So this is actually breaking out and just looking at male patients versus female patients with students. Compare. Why do you think we make that breakdown? It wasn't part of their original hypothesis. Anyone? For one, of just intellectual curiosity, are males more likely to be having these early sexual encounters based off these factors here versus females? Logic would lead you to say probably, right? But you can actually look at the statistics to actually tell you that, right? Typically think of males being typically more promiscuous than females, and you'll actually find out whether or not this actually bears out with the information here. So what do you think based off of one other question here, the full model versus reduced model? What do you think that means? So this is where they actually reduce the number of things that we're controlling for. So if you notice here, there's no unadjusted models that we're looking at. They were only controlling for kind of that full gamut of things we saw in table 2, or they were kind of using a reduced model. And again, look at the legend here. It'll tell you specifically what they were adjusting for here. Okay. And again, the reduced model just takes a few of those variables out to see if there's still an association. And again, this is just something the researchers decided to do. Again, this was all done sort of a priori, and they kind of made up the study. But anyway, what do you kind of notice here between the males and the females? Especially with early cannabis use. Much higher, right? So again, odds ratio of 9 versus 2.8 for the females. So that's interesting, right? Because again, when you looked at them kind of just in general, male and female, you saw there was an association of 6.8, right? See the 6.7 right here. However, when you actually break it down, we can see that the majority of that effect is coming from who? the males, right? I'd say the females are at lower risk by any means. They still have that 2.8 there, 2 times higher likelihood of them having those early sexual encounters, but males tend to be much more associated with that, have much higher odds in those cases there. So sometimes it's good to look to see like where the actual effect is coming from, and particular subsets of patients or students, as the case may be, right? And again, you can look at different factors here, but again, I think it's kind of the bulk of the study. That's what I think is kind of the most interesting thing there, is to see whether or not their hypothesis was actually borne out or not. In this case, we could say that yes, they should reject the null hypothesis, and that yes, there is an association there between the two. Okay. So getting into our final question here. Oh, I guess, are these clinically significant results? What do you guys think? You don't think so? Why not? Is this stuff you're like, well, duh. Obviously. Here's your hand raised. Yes, sir.
Our group said that it's not clinically significant due to the study's inability to determine whether the correlation to the cause and effect relationship, or it's due to other underlying factors such as socioeconomic status, environment, ease of access to cannabis.
That's a very good answer there. Yeah. So again, can you take this information and apply it back to your patients you're going to be dealing with? If you have a concerned mother come up to you and say, like, I think I saw some drug paraphernalia at my son's room. I found he had I guess I don't know what's paraphernalia he used to smoke, a bong. Hey, you found a bong in his room. Is he going to start having early sex? Is he going to get someone pregnant? Could you say yes or no? Depends, right? You say, well, the study, it would appear there's a correlation there that maybe he's more likely to be having sex early on. Maybe he's telling you one thing, but he's certainly doing another. I know adolescents may be known to do that here and there. I pray my girls will never do that to me, but we'll see. Right, but what could you use this information for? So you said it's not clinically significant right now. How could you make it clinically significant?
Taking a shot at it, breaking up into control groups.
Yeah, basically do another study, right? We have to do a different type of design. Maybe we do a prospective sort of design or something where we could try to look for that more strong cause and effect sort of analysis there, right? So again, when you're looking at something being clinically significant or not, is there always a correct answer there? Not always. It's very subjective, right? So again, this depends. If you were working at the Department of Health as an educator, this may be very clinically significant to you, right? You may say, well, this helps me to guide who I should be educating about this sort of stuff. Like, who should I be showing about these safe sex practices, about either using prophylactics or, abstinence or whatever the case may be. Like, how do I target those people who are most likely to benefit from that? That person may very well get some clinical significance out of this versus you as a practitioner dealing with that, that concerned mother, maybe not so much. But again, yes, more studies would help us to get a better cause and effect sort of analysis here. But finding these sort of descriptions here, finding these effects can still be useful. Okay, it doesn't have to be just because we don't see cause and effect doesn't mean we can't take anything away from it. So it's something to consider. Okay, and then finally, what are the limitations of the study here? So, 49. Who is that? Nick, what do you think? What are the limitations of the study here? Stand on up.
So the kids could have lied about actual drug use, or whether they did or not do. They did do drugs or not do drugs. They could have been facetious about their age, initiating. Do that.
Oh, you guys can see live edits. Yeah. Very good. Very good. It's hilarious.
Okay, so they could be lying about how old they were when they actually started having sex. Like they could, maybe some younger guys could say, "Oh, I was younger when I did," or some people may have lied because they were embarrassed by it. So basically, there's kids lying. Study that. So a lot of people weren't enrolled in high school. They could have been public or homeschooled, so they weren't involved in the study. They did have public and private schools still, though, and they also didn't have dropouts as well. And they didn't include the age of other sexual partners, as well as socioeconomic status, and how the drugs were obtained. So, like for family members, if your family members smoke pot, you're more likely to smoke pot because you're exposed to it, or like if your parents do, and like leaves them out a little bit.
So those are all really good limitations. Do you think any of these invalidate the results of the study?
Not really.
Yeah.
Because those are things that like they're going to affect like child how they act. So when you're around parents who smoke pot a lot, you're probably going to do. You don't smoke pot, you're also going to do other things.
Yeah, and so it's important to understand that like, limitations don't necessarily invalidate a study, but those are things that they should be thinking about. Like, well, if we had to do this again, maybe we'd look for this, or maybe this is how it would be nice to have done it, or maybe for future studies they should do this instead. Anytime you read an article, if there's no limitations, that's wrong. Every study has limitations. Like they just either didn't think about it, or they or maybe overconfident in the quality of their study. But again, they should always have limitations there, and you should be thinking about your own limitations too in regards to that study. Be like, well, of course they didn't look at this, and this was something I'd be really interested to know about. Okay, you'll get a better feel for that as you're reading more and more of these articles. So that is pretty much the journal club. Is that helpful at all to actually apply the stuff we've been talking about to an actual case here, right? And again, we're moving more into the epidemiology side of things. We're going to kind of be looking more at articles like that, where they're kind of looking at more kind of population sort of studies, a lot of public health sort of stuff. And again, I'm using the SurveyMonkey results to kind of guide what kind of articles I'm looking for. So I saw a lot of people talked about medical marijuana and that, illicit drugs in general. So I thought this was a good one to start with. But if you have any questions or anything, feel free to let me know. We can talk about it more. Just assign one person from your group to turn in the assignment. I expect to see 10 submissions by tomorrow. Make sure, again, I'm not going to grade them for whether they're correct or not. I just want to see that everyone did it. Make sure everyone's name is on there. Otherwise, you don't get credit for it. And if nothing else, I will see you guys next time. Thank you for everyone who participated. Everyone did very well.